And welcome to this SAT workshop. I'm Kaplan instructor Stephanie. I'm joined by some of my fantastic colleagues, Heather down there in the chat. Apologize for our late start to this presentation, but we're going to get things underway right now. So here's what we're going to talk about. First things first, I want to give you an overview of the SAT. Why does it matter? How does it play a role in the university admissions process, and how you can use the standardized format of the test to your advantage. After that, we're going to talk about some of those Kaplan strategies and the content of the SAT, how you can approach each section of the test. At the end, we're going to talk about some tips for success. So without further ado, let's talk about how the SAT plays a role in that university admissions process. Well, you may know that the standardized testing exam is not the only component of university admissions, but you can see here that it is a fairly significant component to that. Of course, things like your GPA, the course load that you're taking are also significant contributors here, but this could be something that could potentially become a roadblock or a barrier, especially if you have a low SAT score. So you want to make sure that you're putting your best foot forward to ensure that the admissions committee is going to give your application the time that it deserves. Now, the SAT is structured the same way every single time you sit for the exam. You'll always have a 65-minute reading test right up front. Now, this reading test is divided into 5 passages, and knowing the different genres of those passages can also allow you to do something called triaging the test, starting with the passages that you know best and then working backwards. This way, you can take some of the pressure of the clock off your back as you work through some of these sections of the test. There'll always be 1 U.S. and world literature passage, as well as 2 history social studies passages and 2 science passages. Now, you'll also see what's called a paired passage set. These are 2 shorter passages that are related by something like topic, but they have different point of views or perspectives or come at different angles. This will always be from one of those nonfiction genres, so either history social studies or science. Now, after that, you'll have a short break, and then you'll see the writing and language test. The writing language test is also broken up into passages, but this time you're being asked about the writing structure, conventions of English language, what does or does not belong in the passage itself. And the other 50% of the test is math. So 50% of your score is coming from those 2 verbal sections, and 50% of your score is coming from the 2 math tests. One has a calculator, that's the longer second math test, and one does not. Most of these math questions are multiple choice, but you do have a few that are what we call grid-in questions. You can think of these as short response or short answer questions where your response needs to be limited to 4 characters. So these are either integers or decimals or fraction answers. Now, there's also an optional SAT essay, and it's optional in the sense that you can take the SAT without having to sit for the essay component. However, it may not be optional for you if you are applying to a university that requires the essay as part of the application process. So we highly encourage you to sit for that essay. It allows you to keep all of your doors open, and if a school does not want the essay, they simply won't look at it. The essay is scored separately from the SAT, so it does not impact your overall SAT score. Now, speaking of, the SAT is scored on what's called a bell curve. What this means is that your score is reflective of the percentage of students who you scored better than, rather than the percentage of questions you got right or wrong. Now, certainly those 2 things are related. If you get more questions right, then you'll probably do better than more students, but it's not a direct one-to-one correlation. So in that sense, the SAT is a competitive test. You are trying to score better than other students who are sitting for the SAT. And you can see here some of those general scores. 1080 is mathematically average, 50% have done better than that, 50% have not. And looking at something like the 90th percentile is a score that would be about 1340 and above. What this means, especially if you're kind of sitting there in the middle of that bell curve, just answering a few more questions right can significantly leapfrog you over tens of thousands of students by moving you along that percentile curve. So just getting a few more math questions correct, moving a score from 530 to 560 is a 10% jump, and you can see something similar there in writing and language. Well, this is all good information to know, but I see we want to know, so how can you score higher on the SAT? And one of the ways to do that is to have a systematic approach to how you both prepare for the test and also how you approach the test itself. So let's take a look at some of the strategies here for writing and language. Now, again, this is broken up into passages, but you're being asked to change different components of the sentence, insert a sentence, or take things out. What you want to do is you want to read the passage and stop once you hit a particular question. You then want to identify the issue that's being tested. Now, not all things, not all possible grammar concepts, not all possible writing concepts are tested in the writing and language test. So knowing what is and isn't can help you figure out exactly what the right answer is going to be. Grammar issues like sentence structure, subject-verb agreement, whether a colon or an apostrophe are used correctly, those things are issues that are tested. Even something like, is it consistent tone or is it too wordy? Those are issues that are tested. Things like, do I find it interesting? Is it the best way that it could sound? What do I think should go here? Those aren't testable issues on the SAT. So by knowing what is being asked of you, you can then say, all right, I can now give the test what it's looking for, eliminate answer choices that don't fix that specific issue, and then you want to plug in those remaining answer choices. This is important. Plug in the remaining answer choice. Read the sentence in its entirety and select the answer that is both grammatically correct, but it also needs to be the shortest way of being grammatically correct. That's the conciseness there. And it also has to be relevant, meaning it needs to be consistent with the topic, and it also needs to be consistent with the tone. Now, the reason you want to read the entire passage is because there are going to be questions that require you to understand the context of the passage itself. Just because you've hit an underlined section doesn't necessarily mean you have enough context to answer that question or to identify the issue. Sometimes you do, sometimes you need to read the rest of the sentence, sometimes you may even need to read beyond that. So let's look at some of those grammar concepts that are tested here. One of those is going to be comma usage. This is one of the major punctuation marks you're going to see on the SAT. Now, commas have very specific roles. And while it may be kind of customary for you to say, oh, I use a comma when I pause, well, it's true that we often pause when we see a comma, but we also pause when we see lots of other punctuation marks, a full stop, a semicolon, a period, a colon. So just because you're pausing doesn't necessarily mean a comma should go there. It might be a comma or it might be something else. So knowing what the roles of the comma are can allow you to say, is the comma doing a role or is it not? Maybe it shouldn't be a comma, maybe it should be something else, maybe it should be nothing. Now, one of the things a comma can do here is separate independent clauses using a fanboys conjunction. Fanboys is just an acronym for and, nor, but, or, yet. So, and we can see an example here. Notice how everything to the left of the comma could stand alone as a complete sentence. Just finished her homework earlier than expected. We could stop right there, put a full stop or a period. Now, everything after our fanboys conjunction, the so, also stands alone as a complete sentence. She started a project that was due the following week. Another could be complete sentence. So we can combine those with a comma and a conjunction. We wouldn't be able to combine those with just a comma alone. That is what we call a comma splice, and it is one of the most frequently tested sentence structural issues on the SAT. Now, commas can also separate two parts of a sentence, one that could stand alone as an independent clause, and the other that is not. Here we see a part of a sentence that doesn't stand alone. Knowing that soccer practice would be especially strenuous, well, who knew that soccer practice would be especially strenuous? And in fact, we see the answer to that right on the other side of the comma. It's Tia. And if we read the rest of this, we see that everything after the comma could stand alone as its own independent sentence. Commas can also separate items in a list. It's going to be standard convention to have a comma between each item in a list and a comma and before the final item. So here our list is sleeping bag, comma, raincoat, comma, and a lantern. That's that Serial or Oxford comma. You will see that on the SAT. And finally, a comma separates out non-essential information. Now, when I say non-essential, I don't mean that you have to decide whether or not this information is important or whether you think it matters or whether you think it's interesting. I mean, it's just not essential to the structure of the sentence. If you took it out, you would still have a complete sentence. See what happens if we take out everything between those two commas. The sentence now becomes, Professor Mann was known for including a wide variety of reading materials in the curriculum. And that's a complete sentence. So we know that everything between those two commas is not essential. Now, semicolons are not to be confused with commas. Well, they both have, the one little comma tail there. But the semicolon has a very specific role. It combines two could-be complete sentence or two independent clauses. Notice how you can use a semicolon exactly the same way as you could use a full stop or a period. Right. So the semicolon and the full stop or period, those can be used interchangeably on the SAT, meaning if a period works, a semicolon works, and vice versa. You'll never have to choose between those two. So if you have both of them as answer options, well, they're either both right, which can't happen, so it means they must both be wrong. Something else is going on. The semicolon also does one other thing. This is a very minor point, but when you see it, you know it. It separates lists or lists of long phrases rather than a comma, because the comma could make either an extraordinarily long list or could make something confusing. So here you see our first list is like equipment, then we have a list of like snack items, and then like a list of kind of uniform gear, things like that. And each of those lists are separated with a semicolon, and again, we have that semicolon before the final and separating out that last list. And finally, let's talk colons. Now, colons are used to introduce. You're going to have some sort of independent clause before a colon, but it's not quite telling you everything that you wished the sentence had told you. There's some missing information, and that missing information is provided on the other side of the colon. Sanjay had 2 important projects to complete. Well, what were they? And we see that information is provided after the colon, like science experiment and an expository essay. Now, that information after the colon could be a list, it could be a quote, it could be a single word, it could be lots of different phrases, but it will always provide information and answer to some sort of unasked question or unprovided component of information that was introduced in that first introductory clause. Now, other grammar elements you're going to see on test day include things like apostrophes and possession. Be careful when you're dealing with possessive pronouns. And remember that possessive pronouns never have apostrophes. All right, so mine, yours, his, hers, theirs, ours, none of those have apostrophes. So neither should its, their, or whose when they're being used to show possession. If we stick an apostrophe in any of those words, we now have a contraction. It is, they are, or their, who is, or who has. So remember, possessive pronouns never have apostrophes. Pay close attention to its. That's one of those words that's frequently tested on the SAT. Make sure that you are not inadvertently sticking an it is in a sentence when really you want to show possession. All right, let's put some of this to the test. I've got some practice SAT writing and language questions here for you. And we're going to follow that Kaplan method for writing and language. We're going to read the passage until we have enough information to identify what the issue is. Okay, so although, comma. All right, well, hold up. We see a comma underlined. And so already we can say, is this comma doing one of those 4 things that we know a comma does? Is this being separating out 2 independent clauses with a comma fanboys? Well, no, although is not a complete sentence all on its own. Is this separating a list? No, we don't have a list here. We don't have another comma. I mean, we do have another comma later on in the sentence after the word China. If I took that out, would I have a complete sentence? Although a quick check of clothing labels will reveal the name of the country. We don't have a contrast here. So we're not contrasting anything. We don't have a complete sentence, nor do we have a complete sentence on the other side of this. So we can get rid of no change because this is not a role of the comma. Now, we can also eliminate another answer that doesn't fix this issue, which is a semicolon after although. We've already determined that although is not an independent clause, so we can get rid of that one as well. Now we're left between choices B and D. even though you want to pick the shortest grammatically correct answer on test day, you want to make sure that you're not taking out information that was once in the sentence. And if we select answer choice D, we have removed that important contrast word. We now are not showing a contrast between the first part of the sentence and the second part of the sentence. So we just want to remove that comma altogether. Take it out. And now we're going to plug it back in. We see, although most of the products we buy today are made abroad in well-known places like Mexico and China. Okay, that's a dependent clause. And now we see this comma is separating out, and everything on the other side should be a complete sentence. And indeed, we can read it, and it is. Okay. Now, Charis asked a great question. Is there any way to study for the SAT that will greatly improve your score? Yes, there absolutely is. The SAT is a test you can study for. It is a test you can improve on. It's not like an IQ test or just some sort of test of innate ability. It's an exam just like any other kind of content-based exam that you may study for in school. You can practice, you can prepare, you can become familiar with what is tested, how it is structured, what issues you need to learn how to fix, what math content's on the test, and you can improve by doing practice, by familiarizing yourself with it, and by understanding those areas that you don't already know. So absolutely, in fact, that's kind of what we're doing right here. We're doing some practice questions and we're reviewing those answers and explanations. That's actually where you see the biggest score improvement, is recognizing not only why the right answer is right or what the right answer is, but also why those wrong answers were wrong. Let's take a look at another question here. Now here, well, we don't have a grammar problem. Right? We already have fixed our first sentence. And it's Mauritius, well, that is a complete sentence. But we can make this more concise. And because we can make it more concise, the right answer here is not to leave it as it is. The name of the country is being introduced. You know, what is the name of the country that people aren't familiar with? It's Mauritius. And because we're answering some lingering question, because we're introducing something, we can in fact use a colon. We wouldn't want to select answer choice B that's even longer than the initially worded sentence. D is not using a comma correctly. And we can see here that the colon is now both grammatically correct, and it has also made the sentence more concise. And that is what makes a right answer on the SAT. Let's take a look at another one here. Now, right away, we may recognize that we have a type of list. All right, so we know we have a list. We want to make sure that we're using that comma in order to separate each of those items out there in the list correctly. We know that we should have a comma between every single item except for the last one, in which case we need to have a comma before an and. Well, we've got a semicolon just kind of slapped in there randomly, so we're going to get rid of no change. Let's see, we can also eliminate answer choice B because we have two ands, planters and slaves, merchants and artisans. That's not how we'd write a list. Answer choice C doesn't have the and between the final item, so answer choice D is the way to go here. We have now fixed this comma problem. And let's take a look at one more. All right, whose or who apostrophe S. So this is who is or who has. If we read it like that, we see who is collective arrival brought international recognition. No. We're not talking about who is the collective arrival. We're saying that it was these waves of traders and planters and merchants whose arrival, we want the possessive use of who's there. So we're going to get rid of no change. We'll eliminate any answer choice that doesn't fix the issue. And, well, we've only got one that does, and that is answer choice B, paying attention to that possessive pronoun that does not have an apostrophe in it. And now let's look at one of these other sections we're going to see on the test, which is math. Now, the Kaplan method for SAT math is going to ensure that you can streamline your approach to these questions. You want to make sure you're answering them efficiently and effectively. One of the first things you can do here is read the question first. Now, when I say read the question, I don't mean start at the beginning of like problem 2 and start reading the first problem. I mean read the task first. And the question of a word problem tends to appear at the end, the very last sentence. So you want to save yourself some time and read that very last sentence first. Now you know exactly what you're being asked to solve for. So you can go back and read the whole big, long, extra part of the word problem to figure out what you have and what you need in order to get what you're trying to solve for. So it's a way of streamlining your approach. Okay. Now you want to choose the best strategy to answer that question. There's lots of different strategies you could choose. You can do some straightforward math, you can eliminate, you can guess. There's actually no guessing penalty on the SAT. Or you could do something called picking numbers. You could take an abstract concept and you could plug in a sample value and see which one worked. The final step here is that you need to check that you've answered the right question. And I don't mean check that you've bubbled in question 7 under question 7 and bubbled in question 10 under question 10, but rather that question you identified, the task, have you answered it? Sometimes it's very obvious. Sometimes there are logical stopping points along the way where you've done a whole lot of really great math, but you haven't finished the problem. And often those stopping points appear as wrong answer traps. So always take a split second to go back and say, all right, I've solved for X. Is that what I wanted? Oh, it is. Great, I'm done. Oh, I wanted 2x, I wanted y, I wanted x plus 3. I better double it, add 3, solve for something altogether different, whatever that's going to be. All right. So let's talk about some of the content that you're going to see. Functions are a very large component of the SAT. When we're talking about functions, mostly we're just talking about a notational difference from the equations you may otherwise see, linear equations or quadratic equations. Inside the parentheses, you have the input values, the domain, and the function itself gives you the outputs or the range. So we could think of a linear function or a linear equation like this, f of x equals kx plus f of 0. This is very, very similar. This is another way of writing the standard equation of a line, y equals mx plus b. In this case, b, the y-intercept, well, it occurs when x is 0. So we can see that's why we have this represented by f of 0. It is the y value when x equals 0. Another way of describing the y-intercept. So let's take a look at how you can approach functions in graph form. This is asking us for the x value when f of x equals 6. Well, if f of x equals 6, that means that that's a y value. So let's go on the graph and say, okay, what is the x value that gives us a y value of 6? Drop it down, and we can see here that this is -2. This is an important skill for questions such as this. Now, if you've never seen a question like this, you might be thinking like, wow, this is going to be really complex or really complicated. But if you know how to break functions down on a graph, this question is in fact fairly simple. So let's do that right now. Let's go ahead and break this down. The first thing you want to know is h of 0. So take a look at this graph and ask yourself, okay, so what is the y value when x is 0 on the h curve? So the first thing you need to do here is make sure that you are looking at the right function. So our h of x function is this parabola. It's that U-shaped curve. And when x is 0, we see that that intersects with h of x at 4. So h of 0 is 4. We'll now do the same thing with these others. Okay, so g of 2. Well, what is the y value of the g function when x is 2? Well, here we have to, again, make sure that we're looking at the right function. G of x is our cubic curve there, our kind of like our squiggle. And so when x is 2, we see that intersects g of x at this point right here, at 8. And finally, what is f of 2? Well, we've got one function left. That's our line. And we can see that when x is 2, it intersects our line at a value of 3. So f of 2 is 3. Now we'd have to plug this in, substitute those values, and now we just have some arithmetic. Working from those parentheses first, 8 minus 3 is 5, and -3 times 5 is 15. So 4 minus 15 is -11, or answer choice B. So a question that could have looked fairly intimidating, but if you know how to read those functions, can just break it down step by step. Let's take a look at another question that we can simplify by doing some strategic elimination. Now, this is a word problem, so we want to make sure that we go to the very end and see what our task is. Which of the following represents Clara's vote count as a function of time? In this case, we actually don't need any of the rest of the word problem. We can completely skip over it. All we have to pay attention to is the table, knowing, okay, T is days, so V of T is vote count, and we don't even have to read the rest of this problem. We can just save all of that time. So the first thing we can do is we can look over and we can say, well, these different answer options, well, they have different y-intercepts. So what is the original value going to be? And we can look over and say, well, okay, on day 3, we have a y value of 21. So our y-intercept value isn't going to be 21. It's going to be something less than that. So we can eliminate answer choices C and D just like that, just by looking and recognizing that the y-intercept won't be 21 because we have 0.3, 21. And now you have 2 answer options to pick from rather than 4. So plug in a point and see which one works. We can plug in 3 to both A and B to see which one gives us the value that we want. If we plug in 3 to A, we get 21. We don't want to stop right here. Maybe it works for both points. We're going to have to try choice B as well. This one doesn't give us 21. B is out, and A is our winner. So a little bit of strategic elimination can save you a lot of time on these types of questions, as can reading the question first, that very last sentence. All right, let's take a look at another question right here. Now, this time our question is a little bit different. If we go down to the end, we see we want to know what is the value of 2k. All right, so already I'm thinking, the value of k is probably going to be an answer option here. We need to make sure that we double check that we've answered the right question before we bubble in our final answer. Now we have some more information. We've got an equation, and it says it's satisfied at these 2 values, -5 and 7 for x. The first thing we can do is let's get rid of this fraction. Right, fractions are more complicated than necessary. So in this case, we can distribute the fraction rather than multiplying everything by 4, because notice how the coefficients in front of those terms are divisible by 4, right? 4 divided by 4 is 1, -8 divided by 4 is -2. So we can simplify this with distribution rather than multiplying everything by 4, get a few bit smaller numbers. And we can move that 30 over, and so we've now set this quadratic equation equal to 0. The reason we want to do this is because when it says a quadratic is satisfied, those are the values where it's going to intersect with the x-axis. So if this is satisfied when x equals -5 and when x equals 7, well, those are the solutions, which means we could write them out in factored form, x plus 5 and x minus 7. And if we FOILed that out, we'd get another quadratic, x squared minus 2x minus 35 equals 0. Well, we know that these 2 equations are the exact same thing. So if we set them equal to each other, look what happens. The x squareds cancel out. The x's cancel out. And what we're left with is something for k. Negative k over 4 minus 30 equals -35. We have a linear equation. We can solve for k. Add 30 to both sides, multiply both sides by -4, and k is 20. But hold on, before you get overly excited and bubble in answer choice B, make sure you've answered the right question. We've solved for k, we've done some really great work, but that's not what the question wanted, right? The question wants the value of 2k. So I have to double it, multiply it by 2 in order to get answer choice A. And that's why following the Kaplan method for math is always important. Save yourself the headache of missing a question that you've done some really great math on, but just haven't finished all the way. All right, so we'll talk about some tips for success, and I see you've had some questions about this down here in the chat as well, which Heather has been answering. Thank you so much for that, Heather. You want to have a streamlined and strategic approach that's going to help you tackle the SAT. You don't want to just be reviewing old class notes, because your class notes, your old textbooks, those have been preparing you for the texts you're taking in those classes, but they haven't necessarily been preparing you for the same types of structure that you're going to see on these exams. So learn the test strategies like we talked about right here. We gave you strategies for math as well as for writing and language, and then use realistic practice. Use test-like practice so that you can not only be brushing up on the content itself, but the way it's structured, the strategies, the approaches of how to approach an SAT style multiple choice question in the context. You can get access to 6 full-length practice tests and tap your sources of expertise, folks like Heather and I here at Kaplan. There's a lot of different instructional options that we offer. One of the biggest things you want to think about is how long you have before you're taking the test and what resource styles work best for you. So for instance, if you are someone who prefers a self-paced, kind of like to work from a book, like to do some independent practice, you can access a book. You can also review an app or a digital book with a customized cue bank to access a ton of problems on your own. If you're feeling like, yeah, I've got a pretty good sense of these strategies, I just need to see it in the test-like setting, then that could be a great place for you to start. If you're thinking that you need, in fact, some content in terms of brushing up on some of this, being instructed on these types of strategies, well, that is where live instruction comes into play. And we'll talk a little bit about that. We've got in-person classes as well as online classes. These online classes that have set schedules, as well as online on-demand classes that you can just drop into on your own time schedule. Of course, if you want some one-on-one coaching, we certainly offer that as well. And you can also have a video on demand if you need to brush up on some of these core foundations of math. All this comes with 8 full-length practice tests, as well as course books, on-demand instructions, quizzes, and more. Most importantly, you want to have something that's going to instill confidence in you. Confidence is key. So make sure you're confident in your own abilities and find something that's going to instill that confidence in you. Now, I talked about those live on-demand sessions. That's something called the SAT channel. It's almost like you can think of it like the Netflix of SAT prep. And this is just live lessons that you can access, both instructions, kind of like this content. In fact, you see Heather right there in our screenshot of the SAT channel. All of the channel sessions are taught by Kaplan's top instructors. And this is enabling you to kind of zoom in on a very specific area of focus. So you just want to focus in on some math, or you just want to focus in on some geometry. If you just want to focus in on, say, prose fiction passages, you can certainly do that. And you can drop into these courses when they're being done live, or you can access on-demand recordings of them. I talked about our different platforms here. We have live instruction, in-person self-paced with something like a course book or something like a video on-demand library, or of course some one-on-one with the private tutoring. Our live online classes are interactive, and everything comes with something called a smart report. When you're asking yourself, what do I study? Well, you can get some pretty good sense of like, I need to study math or I need to study reading, but that doesn't really tell you where to go. What does is knowing what type of math questions am I missing? What type of reading questions am I missing? What type of grammar concepts or writing language questions do I need to brush up on? Where am I losing points? And that's where an analysis of practice tests can really play a big role. This will allow you to refine your study approach. So rather than just saying you need to study for the SAT, well, that's huge. That's too much to kind of absorb. You can break it down into manageable and measurable chunks. All right, I need to work on linear equation questions, comma questions, questions that require me to match up with tone, and questions that are looking at the main idea of a reading text. Okay, now you know where your big point questions are coming from. You can focus there, and then you can just brush up on the others. You can also know your strengths. Strengths are also really important. So when you're reviewing your own work, first off, always review. That's the reason you do practice problems. It's not to see what you're getting right or wrong, but in fact to review and figuring out why you're getting things right, and are you getting them, or why are you getting them wrong? Are you getting them right for the most efficient reason, for the right reason? And that's going to allow you to continue to build towards your test day expertise. You can see here what our SAT instructional courses include at the various levels. Like we say, the math foundations. For those of you who may be thinking about doing either the SAT or the ACT, anything with Prep Plus, that includes one-on-one coaching as well as access to the other test resources. And of course, everything comes, anything beyond self-paced includes that SAT channel, as well as access to smart reports and things like that. All right. Well, we want to know what questions you have for Heather and I. The main thing I want you to take away here is that this is something you can practice for. You can study for it, you can prepare for it, your score can and will improve with practice, the right practice. In fact, we guarantee it. We have something called a higher score guarantee because we know that this is something that you can continue to work upon, and it's something you can indeed improve upon with the right resources. So let Heather and I know what questions you have for us, and we wish you the best of luck on your college entrance exams, as well as throughout the entire university admissions process. All right, Petros has a great reminder here. Don't forget to sign up for our SAT resource giveaway by filling out that form back there when you are in the other room there. So got that link there in the chat for you below. Make sure you go ahead and fill that out. There'll be a raffle for some of those resources later on. Well, thank you so much for joining myself, Heather, as well as Petros. And you can, of course, reach out at kaptest.com, and you can also find ways to contact for future questions there as well. Now, Karen has a question. What are the differences? What are the prices for the different plans on Kaplan? Well, if we go back to the course options here, it does kind of increase. So the prices do increase as you move from left to right over here. If you're looking for like a really economical option, that's going to be something like one of the Kaplan retail books. You can find those for fairly low price points. Self-paced tends to start at around $300 US, and then it kind of moves up from there. You can, in fact, check out kaptest.com for the latest promotional offers. There's often some promos going on there as well, Karen. So check out kaptest.com for the latest pricing information because it's always changing a little bit. So I don't want to misquote the right price there. But you can definitely see some of those promos being offered there, and again, it does kind of increase as you move from left to right over here. So a self-paced option, you're looking at a couple $100. Private tutoring is going to be priced per hour. So depending on how many hours of private tutoring you're looking at. SAT Prep Plus is one of perhaps, I would say, the best deal. This gives you access to not only the entire SAT course, that's 18 hours of live instruction with one of the top instructors like Heather or myself. It also includes access to the SAT channel, as well as 3 one-on-one coaching hours with one of our fantastic coaches, so they can help you put together a study plan, review practice tests with you. So the SAT Prep Plus is kind of a good option if you want all the instruction of a course, you want lots of additional practice outside, but you also still want a little bit of that personalized kind of one-on-one planning that private tutoring would certainly offer without having to do an entire private tutoring package. And Heather's got the link to all of the SAT options below there in the chat for you. Thank you so much, Heather. Well, thank you all for attending this. Hopefully this clarified a few of the questions about the SAT and perhaps a few of those misconceptions you may have had about it. Ultimately, we want to make sure that you have strategies and a strategic approach. This is something you can tackle. It is something that you can master. We want to make sure you are confident on test day. Best of luck, everyone. Take care. And we wish you all the best success in the university admissions process.